nations. It is only when African nations are able to meet these tests that they would have any real possibility of a future worthy of mention. It is only when African nations can equip themselves in respect of this monumental task that they can claim nationhood worthy of mention or any right to even utter the word sovereignty. These, therefore, are the objectives with which African nations should concern themselves, and thus, with reference to which their progress or lack thereof should be assessed. Against this backdrop, my brothers and sisters, at this critical juncture in their respective histories, as has been the case for virtually all successful nations, the indispensable requirements for the success of African nations include clarity and unanimity of purpose, selfless altruistic devotion, and bold, innovative, vigorous, and decisive leadership, all of which are required to take advantage of the many potential opportunities which present themselves in the course of undertaking a nation-building project and to effectively address the many threats that confront new African nations. At this determinative stage of nation building, at which most still nascent African nations find themselves, it is imperative that the conditions under which the populations can rally around a unifying vision and program for architecting and building the nation. It is essential that during this stage that the conditions exist, the African people, as much as their leaders, selflessly sacrifice and forego and defer as much as possible. All of these requirements are not only prerequisites for successfully prosecuting the nation-building project in which most African nations are engaged, but also ultimately the only means of securing true independence and dignity for the people of Africa. Therefore, in the course of my third expedition into systems of governance in Africa, I was confronted with a veritable contradiction against the imperatives and indispensable preconditions for success in the critical formative stages of African nations. There persists a stubbornly imbecilic subscription to a system of governance, specifically a model of democracy, which is perfectly ill-suited to the conditions and circumstances of African nations, and which is, in fact, positively a hindrance to achieving the objectives of architecting and constructing unified, secured, and prosperous African nations. The evidence to this effect is so glaring from one African country to another that no evidence needs to be adduced to establish the veracity of the conclusions of my expedition into this system of governance, the model of democracy in vogue in Africa. I will, however, offer a few illustrative instances about the disconnect between what is required for nascent African nations to succeed versus the real consequences of the model of democracy being practiced across the continent. Whereas our circumstances dictate a common overarching national vision and unity of purpose, the model of democracy blindly and erroneously adopted in Africa has as its core tenet just the opposite: multiple contradictory visions or clamorously vying to be simultaneously implemented, which has served as a perfect recipe for chaos, stagnation, and retrogression right across the African continent. Whereas our circumstances dictate, whereas visionary and transformative leadership is indispensable to the African nation-building project, the model of democracy in practice in Africa forces the leader to be unduly cautious and consultative to the extent of being paralyzed and ineffectual, concerned with trivial political considerations such as, quote-unquote, upsetting a particular political base or, quote-unquote, political balance, rather than focusing on the big picture and the long term as is dictated by our circumstances. Whereas our situation demands bold, vigorous, and decisive leadership, the so-called multi-branch checks and balances system, especially as has been misconstrued and misapplied across Africa, has had a particularly debilitating effect on African governance, rendering leaders ineffective and incapable of responding to the exigencies entailed in architecting and constructing a new nation. Whereas clear, definitive answers are required on issues of importance to African nations, the prevailing model of democracy encourages least common denominator solutions, which are not particularly apt under the circumstances, in light of the fundamental nature of most of the issues at hand. Whereas great sacrifices are required from all Africans, especially our leaders, the perverted model of democracy at work in Africa encourages and perpetuates a system where the first priority of many players in the system is advancement and enrichment of themselves to the detriment of the nation. For example, the artificial term limits imposed on elected officials has no affinity whatsoever to the time frame required to achieve the nation-building project with which African states should be concerned, and has proven to be taken by some and exploited for the wrong reason. Whereas what is required is a system under which politics facilitates the nation-building process. What has developed is a model of democracy that has commoditized politics, made politics into something to be bought and sold and profited from to the detriment of the objectives of building prosperous and secure African nations. Whereas there is a necessity that African nations focus on larger national interests and the common welfare, the model of democracy in practice in Africa, by default, encourages issues to be decided on the basis of political, sectional, and other considerations which detract from larger national interests. This copycat model of democracy, slavishly aping Western models, insists that individual rights are the priority, even to the detriment of the greater good and the nation-building project. As a consequence, for example, freedom of speech, which finds its most misconstrued and irresponsible manifestation in Africa, has had the effect of making African nation-building projects akin to constructing the biblical Tower of Babel, which could not be achieved because of the confusion of people speaking in different languages, and therefore unable to meaningfully communicate amongst themselves. But, before we go too far in misunderstanding this speech as being against democracy and rights, let me make emphatic that the point here is not that democracy, or any right for that matter, is bad per se, but that democracy, where applied out of context and without reference to the objectives sought to be achieved, is unavailing and even dangerous, because it begets disillusionment, which encourages extreme reaction on the parts of populations, which usually, ultimately, results in tyranny. As such, wherever democracy manifests itself in this ugly form, or better yet, where sheer silliness masquerading as democracy rears its head, it must be checked. This unfortunately happens to be the case with which we are confronted in Africa, which I believe explains the legacy of failure across the continent. The warped model of democracy which has been unleashed upon the people of Africa is the root cause for why many African politicians, unfortunately, including many extraordinary politicians on the continent who are deeply committed to the transformation of Africa, are woefully ineffectual in respect of responding to the hopes and aspirations of their people, and therefore, ultimately why despair prevails across Africa. And I say to you again, my dear brothers and sisters, our beloved continent cries. And the cries of the continent pains my soul even more deeply and agonizingly, because I've had the chance to see firsthand and intimately how this model of democracy that prevails in Africa can stymie genuine efforts by able and committed leaders in Africa to change the fortunes of their people. This statement may be construed by some as an attempt to defend and exempt President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. To this, I would say two things. First, President Sirleaf does not need to be defended, since in the final analysis and detached from the short-term view of things and looking at the totality of the circumstances, her overall legacy will shine through resplendently. Second, if they should persist in their criticism that I am defending President Sirleaf, I can but say, proudly guilty as charged. The failure of Africa is a calamitous failure of vision and imagination. The failure of Africa is a failure of initiative and decisiveness. The failure of Africa is the failure in terms of the ability to separate what is important and urgent for what is unimportant and not pressing. The failure of Africa is the failure of pragmatism. The failure of Africa is the failure in terms of the ability to deal with the problems which confront the continent, with which the continent is actually confronted, rather than those which are imagined. The failure of Africa is the failure to understand the inextricable link between successfully prosecuting the nation-building exercise and the ability to respond to the basic day-to-day requirements and demands of ordinary Africans. For example, is it possible to provide jobs to our people if we have not succeeded in the nation-building exercise of creating the economic conditions which are necessary for meaningful and sustainable job creation? But in addition to the model of democracy in practice by its nature being a hindrance to the achievement of critical objectives of African nations, it has features which positively militate against achieving these objectives. This system, through its so-called popular elections, which in some instances have been bastardized into vote buying exercises, tend to favor the wrong types of people who have neither the inclination nor interest in solving the problems confronting the people of Africa. People who have no vision to see beyond today into a new future, and neither the courage nor the fortitude to act on and sustain any transformational initiative. This system is heavily skewed towards placing politicians in power who are the wrong match for the monumental challenge with which Africa has to contend. While Africa is being consumed in a veritable conflagration, these types are engaged in such futile nonsense as the niceties of parliamentary procedural exactness and who wears the finest powdered wig. Yes, people still wear powdered wigs in African parliaments. They dither while our people die of curable disease. As one generation of Africans after another receive no education and languish in ignorance, as Africans cannot find jobs and therefore livelihoods. All conditions which perpetuate a vicious cycle of ignorance, underdevelopment, poverty, and despair. The model of democracy in modern Africa is perfectly engineered for failure and to keep Africans mired in the current